What's going on, guys? Welcome into the Fantasy Pros podcast. You may have noticed I'm not Bobby. Instead, we have replaced him with someone far better looking. But before we let you know who that is, I, of course, am your host for today's show, Mike Tagliere, and you can find me on Twitter at Mike Tagliere NFL. Today's guest is one of my best buddies in the industry. He is known to be the king of wide receivers and has built his brand through the hashtag Reception Perception, among other things like bad food takes. But in all seriousness, welcome one of my favorites to the show, NFL.com's Mr. Matt Harmon. Matt, how you doing, buddy?
I'm good, man. It's good to be talking to you today. I think that's a perfect introduction in terms of what I actually do, and then what I'm really trying to, give some propaganda to the people, and that's, about food takes and everything else that's on my mind. This wide receiver thing is kind of just a front, but I guess if that's what I'm here to talk about today, we can focus on that.
We're going to focus on that today, and that's actually the premise of today's show. We've gone through quarterbacks, we've gone through tight ends, we've gone through running backs, but today's show, of course, having Matt on, we are going to talk a lot about wide receivers, and if you guys haven't heard, he's doing a thing with the fantasy footballers. Matt, if you want to give a little promo to that, I want to make sure that I give you props for coming on the show and share what you're doing with them this year.
I would love to give a little promo for that. So this year I did partner with the fantasy footballers, as you mentioned, to give out more reception perception data to the public than ever before. I mean, this is unprecedented to give out this much data. It's been a lot of work on my part, and I'm happy that it's kind of starting to unwind. So they put out their first edition of their Ultimate Draft Kit last year, and that was already a raging success as much as it is by itself. You get tiers and rankings and fantasy draft advice and everything like that. But now this year, since I've joined on with the partnership, I'll be featuring over 50 wide receivers data from the NFL, and then also every rookie that I charted this year, which was about 19 guys. And if you're not familiar with reception perception, if you're listening, what it is it's an in-depth methodology to evaluate the wide receiver position based on how well they run routes, how often they run each route, how often they get open on each particular pattern, and which coverage they're most successful in. So if you want to understand a wide receiver, I believe reception perception gives you the best way of doing so, and I really just break down everything that you could possibly imagine of what a wide receiver does on the field. And so you're getting access to 50 guys, the top 50 guys in their rankings, their reception perception data, and that includes a whole host of players. So if you want to purchase the Ultimate Draft Kit, by the day we're recording this, there's 8 days left to pre-order before it launches on June 1st. You can do so at receptionperception.com. There's a little link there to send you to the Ultimate Draft Kit to purchase it.
No, that's awesome. And that's the thing. So I wanted to give you that moment to do it. We appreciate you hopping on the show to talk about that. We're going to talk about a lot of those receivers today. My goal was I got a list together for Matt. I want to talk to him about these wide receivers. So instead of doing like a rankings thing, we're going to touch on the most pressing topics as we head into 2017 and the wide receivers that, they're kind of like on that borderline. When you get there in a draft, you don't know whether or not you want to take them, but we're going to talk about all those situations. But before we do that, Matt, what we're going to do is I did send out a tweet, we've been backed up on the mailbox, so I want to make sure that I actually get to some listener questions before we move into the wide receivers. So we're going to answer these together. Matt, the first question we got is from JMR. He's saying that he has he's traded LaShawn McCoy, Tyreek Hill, and Ezekiel Elliott. Wow, that's a big haul. For the number 1 through number 5 first-round picks in the upcoming rookie draft. What does this mean for his dynasty team?
Okay, so he traded away Zeke, McCoy, and Tyreek Hill, you said? Was there anybody else?
Nope, those 3, and then it's for the number 1 through number 5. So we know pretty much who the top 5 picks are.
Right, so hypothetically, you're probably coming away with Corey Davis, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, Joe Mixon, and whoever
Mike
you're
Williams.
taking, Mike Williams or Dalvin Cook, whatever is kind of your flavor. Yeah, I don't know. These rookies tend to be so hit or miss. I know a lot of people like Jake Rickroad have done really good work in terms of just how much these rookies just tend to not really matter. And we obsess over rookie picks in Dynasty, and it's like the main form of currency. But at the same time, I just would if it was me, I would prefer to have Zeke, especially as kind of like a transformative figure on your dynasty team. And I'm also really high on Tyreek Hill and his ability to potentially do more than just what we saw from him in year one. So if it was me, I'd rather have those three players. But since he's already made the deal, I mean, I think you're definitely going full blown youth movement. And also I would explore trading some of those picks away for some established veterans too. Like, I don't think you necessarily have to pencil yourself in that you're just going to use all those picks either.
Right, and that's what you have to figure out. So, like, upon listening to it, it's like, oh my God, you traded away Zeke. But then you look at it and you say, you know, when you're trading a stud like, say, Odell Beckham or Antonio Brown or someone like that, you're usually looking to get 3 first-round picks in return. And the fact that you have 5 first-round picks out of these guys, I'm not really opposed to it. I mean, up front, it stinks losing these players off your roster. But if you're in a youth movement and you just want to totally rebuild your team and understand that you're not going to compete for probably 3 years, I'm okay with it. I'm not a big fan of losing studs like Ezekiel Elliott, who landed in the perfect situation. You know, I love Leonard Fournette. I think he's just as good a talent as Ezekiel Elliott is, but he didn't land in the situation that Zeke did. So, you know, there's things about it that are good. I don't think you ruined your team, JMR. So thanks for the question. I want to make sure we get a couple more in here. We have one from Tony R. Now, this one was specific to you, Matt. He said that he's dabbled in zero RB before, but has yet to fully commit. After last season, he's thinking that zero RB could actually be the contrarian play this year. He says, I'm getting a lot of 2015 vibes from the top current ADP trends. If so, who are some of the later round running backs that you're targeting to fill in those RB spots?
Yeah, we get this question we do a weekly mail satchel episode of our Fantasy Hipsters podcast, and we seem to get this question every week, whether like going back to zero RB is the contrarian move for 2017. And I totally get where they're coming from, but you're right. The most important thing is to identify some of those potential late round running backs. And, you know, looking over Fantasy Football Calculator ADP right now, like, there are obviously guys that are yearly candidates for this in terms of, especially if you play in PPR leagues, like pass catching guys like Theo Riddick going around the 10th round, CJ Prosise going in the 10th round. I'm pretty interested in him because I'm not totally in on the Eddie Lacy experience in Seattle. Samaje Perine's at 11th round pick right now. That's like obvious, but it seems to be that he will, those sort of players will rise. I mean, it's important to monitor those rookies that are in kind of unstable backfields, you know, in terms of Perine and also Kareem Hunt in Kansas City. I think those rookies tend to get boosted up the board too high, but I will be monitoring him if they stay in the late rounds. And one guy I really like is Terrence West in Baltimore, because right now Kenneth Dixon's suspended for the first 4 games. He's pretty much locked in as like the early 2-down banger. There'll definitely be game scripts where he's kind of phased out of the offense, but at a double-digit round value, I mean, you're getting a starting running back in an offense, and I think that that's still a good bargain in that area. So you're kind of looking for those sort of players.
Yeah, I think you're right with the Perine pick. I think that's a really good one. I think Danny Woodhead, if you're in a PPR league, he's going to be fine. Someone's got to catch the ball there in Baltimore. Duke Johnson is one of my favorite ones. He was this time last year, he was talked about as a top 20 running back, and then it just so happened that Crowell kind of took that role. But if for some reason Crowell struggles or if Crowell gets hurt, Duke Johnson's going to walk into an RB1 role. Like, it's immediately. I think that we can argue that the Cleveland Browns offensive line might be the most talented in the league right now after Dallas lost a couple offensive linemen. Oakland is right up there too, but there's quite a few, and I don't want to focus on one question too long, but yes, you can always do zero running back, but I am never, ever, ever the type to tell you to stick into one strategy. Take, as the draft goes, you kind of take it as is. I never walk in with one strategy saying, I want to do this, I want to do this.
Yeah, and I agree with you, man. And I don't mean to interrupt you, but yeah. I totally agree with that thought process. Like, well, there are some principles in a draft that I almost always employ. Like, I almost always wait on a quarterback, but that's kind of like everybody waits on a quarterback now. Right. It's not like a cute thing to say anymore. But in terms of zero RB, I mean, I was pushing the strategy very heavy last year, and a lot of that is because, at the outlet that I worked at, it was like a newer thing, and it was a big conversation point, and I thought that it needed to be represented with a lot of fervor there, so I did. But at the same time, you're right. You should never pencil yourself into one particular strategy. Every draft is very fluid. If you get in some of these writer league drafts, I mean, everybody goes wide receiver early, so it's hard to be the one to kind of, then everybody's just going with the same current, and sometimes you want to be the koi fish and swim against the current. So there's something to that for sure.
Yes, definitely. Take value when it's presented to you, regardless of what position it is. The last question before we get into some wide receivers, we are going to take a question from James F. James F says he's in a keeper league and he wants to win this year. So we have to keep it in mind that he wants to win this year. Sammy Watkins or Brandon Cooks?
It's always a good goal to try to win. Just in my humble opinion.
But not so worried about the future. He's like
Right.
not worried about like multi-year keepers. He's worried about this year. Who would you rather have?
That is actually a pretty tough question because, I mean, hypothetically, I think if one of these guys is going to be a wide receiver one, it would be Sammy Watkins. Like, if everything broke right. Like, I just cannot tell myself the story where, being realistic, where Brandon Cooks becomes that player in the New England offense, or how his fantasy value is any better in New England than it was in New Orleans. But I'm sure we'll get to that later. But so if you really just going all out to win this year, I kind of am tempted to go with Watkins, but that feels so. But it also feels like the wrong answer because, I mean, we know it's good. Like essentially we know the Sammy Watkins story at this point. Like, it's a great ideal situation to be a target hog of an offense with a pretty good quarterback. I mean, I like Tyrod Taylor a lot, but
Love him.
But at the same time, you're always waiting for the other, no pun intended, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop with his injury there. So I don't know. I tend to go with Watkins there because I think it's the ceiling move over the safe pick.
I like it too. And you know what? I'm actually going to take that right into our wide receiver talk because that was my second question, but we might as well start off with it. In terms of Sammy Watkins, so the stat I have for you, Harmon, is that if we take away the first 2 games of 2016, remember where Watkins was trying to play through that injury and they ultimately shut him down, they put him on that long-term IR.
Yeah.
So if we remove those 2 games to start the season, and that's all we remove. We keep the end of the season and we take what was in 2015, okay? The last 15 games that Tyrod Taylor and Sammy Watkins have played together, 15 games. Keep in mind, that's one short of a full season. 115 targets, 71 receptions, almost 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns. While missing that one game, that would have totaled the number 5 wide receiver last year. And I think Watkins, I don't even think we've seen the best of Watkins because if you recall, Matt, towards the end of the 2015 season, Watkins kind of turned it on, and over the last 6 weeks, he went bananas. And now, they have an aging LaShawn McCoy. They really don't have much depth behind him. Jonathan Williams, who has seen a handful of carries in his career. Robert Woods is gone. Chris Hogan is obviously gone. He was there in 2015. But you look at everything, and Zay Jones should help take away some attention from Sammy Watkins. So, I mean, I guess, I know we kind of touched on it, but are you expecting a bounce back from Sammy Watkins? Do you feel comfortable drafting him in the 3rd round of a fantasy draft?
The 3rd round is a tough price to pay. I always look at picking fantasy players in terms of putting it in context with what you've done on the rest of your draft, so I'm not really comfortable with Sammy Watkins heading in as my number 1 receiver, but let's just play the hypothetical game and say you've gone, early wide receiver and you've gone with, Julio Jones in the 1st round or an Odell Beckham, something like that. And then maybe you even doubled back with a wide receiver in the 2nd round. And then you're standing there with Sammy Watkins with your 3rd round pick. And I kind of get taking him in that situation because you're a little bit insulated from his downside and you're completely exposed to his upside. And then at that point, obviously, you're kind of taking a more, at least somewhat zero RB path with Sammy Watkins. So I kind of get taking him in that sense. But just in terms of, what he can do as a football player, I mean, you're right. His 2015 data, which is what's going to be included in the Ultimate Draft Kit because he fell just below what I'd like to sample in terms of snaps and games played for the 2016 season. That was really fantastic. I mean, his data there, his success rate versus man and press coverage was along the 74th percentile, so one of the better scores there. He gets separation on not just deep routes, but also the short to intermediate routes. I mean, he's an easy separator. But the one question with him, his rookie year data was pretty poor, but he was also playing through with a hip injury his rookie year. And then last year, obviously, was a little belabored with injuries as well, as you mentioned. I think, and this is a total guess, but I would say he's just one of these players that doesn't necessarily, because he relies so much on quickness and technique, when he is banged up, he's not one of the best at playing through injuries. And you definitely see his scores in terms of what he does as a separator be depressed when he is injured, which isn't that's not groundbreaking, but again, it's just a guess as to what he is. So, I mean, the injuries are the biggest concern, but he has a great ceiling both from a week to week and season long perspective if he stays healthy.
Agree, and I think that he's worth more in a best ball format than he is in a standard format, in a week-to-week thing. I love taking Sammy Watkins in the 3rd round of MFL 10s just because I know what his weekly ceiling is compared to those who are being taken around him, and I trust in Tyrod Taylor more than I do someone like Blake Bortles throwing to Allen Robinson, even though I love Allen Robinson's potential. But staying in, Sammy Watkins, it's funny how this kind of like works into the next topic I wanted to talk about. In 2015, there were 3 wide receivers who finished in the top 24 without seeing 105 targets. Sammy Watkins was one of them. The other was Doug Baldwin. And the number 3 one was John Brown. John Brown of the Arizona Cardinals is... me personally, I am very, very close to putting him above Larry Fitzgerald in my rankings. Now, I know that that's kind of like a hot take and not many people want to do that, but I think that right now, John Brown is the steal of fantasy drafts, whether it be an MFL 10, whether it be a startup dynasty draft, whatever the case is. Are you with me, Harmon, that you think that it's potentially the case that John Brown might be better than Larry Fitzgerald in 2017?
Hell yeah, man. I'm here for all John Brown hype. You know that.
Yes.
That's been one of my guys the last few years. And I think it's funny because with Larry Fitzgerald, I feel like we've been waiting for the other, to use that phrase again, waiting for the other shoe to drop for like the last 2 years. And like, is Michael Floyd going to overtake him as the number 1? Is John Brown going to overtake him as the number 1? And of course, last year, Larry Fitzgerald, far and away the most productive Arizona Cardinals receiver last year. John Brown, like, talk about just a mess of a season last year health-wise. I mean, he had the concussion in preseason, which Bruce Arians said, like, he missed way too much time, which is why he wasn't playing early in the season all that much. And then as soon as he started to kind of get his groove going, that's when he gets diagnosed with the sickle cell trait. He gets there was like a cyst on his spine or what have you. So just everything that could go wrong did go wrong. So he definitely feels like an easy bounce-back candidate. In terms of his reception perception, like I mentioned, he's long been one of my favorites. His rookie year was fantastic. Then he had one of the 10 best scores in success rate versus man coverage with the 76% success rate. His sophomore season, where, as you mentioned, he was inside the top 24 receivers without seeing too much volume. This past year, I think the health did take a toll on him, but his scores weren't like disastrous or anything. His success rate versus man coverage fell down to about 69% from 76%, which is the lowest of his 3-year career. But I'm with you that, I mean, at this point, even without looking at his ability, the offense is kind of set up for him to start alongside Larry Fitzgerald and be the number 2 receiver there at worst. But I mean, Fitz is kind of, we've seen the same season 2 in a row here as he starts off hot, and then, especially as the offense overall falls apart around him, he goes along with it because he's just mostly like, I think people would be shocked at how similar the route trees are for a Jarvis Landry and a Larry Fitzgerald type player. It's weird to say that because one's a future Hall of Famer, but they're used in the exact same way.
No. It's crazy. Well, Fitz has kind of transformed over his career and has become this slot guy. Now John Brown's literally the number 1 wide receiver. I think I guess you could say the prototypical number 1 lining up on the perimeter the majority of the time. Him and JJ Nelson will be outside, Larry Fitzgerald in the slot. I think if there's one thing I want you guys to take away from this show is that John Brown is being severely underdrafted. I want to say that he was going outside the top 40 wide receivers in ADP. There was a time that it was outside the top 50, but I'm sure that's going to move up as we hear more and more encouraging things about his health. One of the things I wanted to talk with you about, Matt, now we recently hosted our Dynasty Startup League for the Fantasy Pros, and we invited a bunch of, analysts, that do ranking on our site. And so we know that you're one of the analysts that's going to slowly back away from fantasy football and you just want to talk about football. And I understand it because at some point you have to figure out, are you the advice giver or are you the player? And I've made the transition to where I'm an advice giver. I am that more than a player right now, where it's just like I enjoy analyzing the game and talking about it. Now, in this draft, I took John Ross as I think it was the 41st wide receiver off the board. And I said, why was he still on the board, guys? Like, am I wrong here? Or am I too high on him? Because I have him as a top 30 wide receiver in my dynasty rankings. And everybody said that I'm probably too high on him. I think people are just putting a stereotype on John Ross when I think that he's closer probably to a T.Y. Hilton than he is like a Deshaun Jackson. Am I right?
I'm 100% with you there. And, you talked about, like, obviously my career goals is to eventually just talk about players more so than it is to talk about fantasy football. And a lot of that is because of this sort of thing that we're talking about with John Ross here. And that's because I'm just really passionate about kind of taking away those sort of stereotypes or misnomers or things that people just assume. And I think speed receivers get thrown into just all, like, the entire archetype of speed receivers gets thrown into like one pejorative category of just one trick ponies or whatever. And it's because of these sort of assumptions that we are talking about here. And I'm with you that Deshaun Jackson, I mean, he's a great player, and he's kind of
Right.
like the exception to the rule of the one-trick ponies, that he's been able to sustain it over his entire career. But, you know, in terms of a player like a Will Fuller compared to a John Ross, I mean, it's not even close as to who's the superior prospect to me. Ross did so well in college, getting off the line of scrimmage when he was pressed. You know, there are definitely some games where he wasn't as productive against like an Alabama, but you can also look at the way his quarterback was disrupted in that game. But if you look at his reception perception, obviously he has great success rate on those deep patterns, but he's also highly successful on digs, outs, and flat routes, because he not only does he get so much cushion, but he's able to sell the defender on the fact that he's going to take every single route deep, and when he doesn't tip things off with his head or with his eyes, then he's able to snap back to the sideline or snap back inside, and that just gives quarterbacks just easy chunk throws. So I definitely think he can go along the T.Y. Hilton sort of high end of that archetype of receivers. And in that case, then Cincinnati has a really exciting 1A with A.J. Green and then a potential 1B with John Ross.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. And AJ Green's coming towards not saying that the end of his career, but he's coming up on 30 now. Like, it's crazy how fast these careers are kind of just going by. I think AJ Green's going to be 28 or 29 this year. But I'm happy to hear that you're with me on John Ross. I think that it has been a stereotype that's been attached to him, and I just think he's a much better receiver than people think. Not only after the catch, he's phenomenal after the catch, but he's great. He's a great route runner that can make people like literally fall down. If you've watched some tape on him, you've seen him make cornerbacks fall down. But moving on to another rookie that's part of a situation that I'm a little weary of in fantasy football. So first, the Chargers wide receiver core was already becoming difficult to predict but this is before they picked Mike Williams at number 7, because Tyrell the Gazelle came out and he played really well. You had Keenan Allen coming back from injury. They signed Travis Benjamin to a big free agent contract, just a year ago. Dontrell Inman made some strides last year. Looked like he could do things. Hunter Henry, Antonio Gates, Melvin Gordon, like all these names add up and you're like, where am I going to distribute these points? And then number 7 pick in the NFL draft, like the last name that I expected to hear out of the Chargers was Mike Williams. And sure enough, it is. So it's just becoming this even more difficult situation to figure out, where do you see Mike Williams? Do you see him passing Tyrell? Do you think he starts right away? Give me your take on the wide receiver situation in San Diego.
Yeah, for the second year in a row, the Chargers are a receiver core that I really like. Last year, I wrote an article for NFL.com saying that they were a top 5 wide receiver core in the NFL. And then, of course, they all proceeded to get hurt. So this year, I'm a little reticent about hyping up the poor Chargers again. But this is a fascinating wide receiver core to me, like I mentioned. And it does come down, like it just got a lot more interesting. As you mentioned, number 7 overall, they take Mike Williams. I was certainly not expecting that. There were some small whispers that they were interested in Williams, but I definitely wasn't taking that seriously. Lo and behold, that's what they do. And the more at first people were like, what are they doing? They don't need this player. But I wrote about this on, you can go to receptionperception.com to see my reaction to all the first round pick wide receivers. And the more I thought about the pick in the moments after the draft and the night of, the more I liked it, and it kind of made sense to me. And it's because the Chargers don't really have a receiver like Mike Williams on the roster currently. They have Keenan Allen, who is one of my favorite players. I mean, his reception perception from 2015 is fantastic. Like, not only does he have one of the 3 best scores in success rate versus man coverage, it's above average on almost every route on the route tree. He's also great in contested situations, but he's not necessarily a vertical threat. Whereas Mike Williams is more of that guy that can win along the boundaries, can get vertical and win contested catches. He was the second best receiver in the draft class this year for me in reception perception and winning contested catches. So, and he just makes a lot of sense in terms of a Malcolm Floyd type receiver who Phillip Rivers made music with for years and years. So in that sense, I get why they picked him. The question is, what are they telling us about Tyrell Williams? Because Williams was fantastic last year. In reception perception confirms it. He had an above average success rate versus coverage score on all but 2 routes of the route tree. And while he is a big body receiver, he is much more of a guy that you want to get in space. And you mentioned the Gazelle, like that's why he got that nickname, is because they would get him in space on those slant routes, and then he would just break tackles. He would make plays with speed. But he, again, not a guy that's going to win along the boundary or like a Mike Williams is. So I get why they made that fit. And then this is, not even talking about Travis Benjamin, who they just paid a pretty good amount of money last year. too, and really is a good player as well, who fits that speed role, who also can win on slant routes. So, I mean, they really have 4 guys that I think they can spread the field with. They can put, Keenan Allen and Benjamin maybe in the slot, or Williams in the slot, and they can do a lot of things that are going to confuse defenses, but it's also going to confuse fantasy owners too.
Yes.
In terms of splitting up these targets. And that's not to mention that they have 2 tight ends that are going to command looks. They have a running back who has proven that he can at least be competent as a pass catcher. So yeah, these Chargers are going to be tough to figure out. And, a lot of people are going to have the take of like, well, just don't discount Tyrell Williams too much. And I get that point. But at the same time, I always say, doesn't matter what you think about these players. It matters what the team thinks about these players. And if they really like Mike Williams, he's going to get on the field. But for me, I'm not going to be aggressive about grabbing any Chargers receiver outside of Allen, especially right now, because we just don't have a lot of clarity and there's an awful lot of options there.
Well, there is, and not just that, but they play in a really tough division. Their schedule is really tough this year, so it's really not friendly to the pass. So when you go through that, even Allen, for me to an extent, I have difficulty going with him, because looking over his career, when he sees fewer targets in a game, he doesn't really produce. A lot of his production has come in the higher target games. Now, will the quality of his targets increase? Most likely, yes. Now, my take on it is that they should keep both Williams outside, and they should put Keenan Allen in the slot, and then have Travis Benjamin and Dontrell Inman kind of just playing, for depth at this point, and you have to worry about that with Keenan Allen's, history. But it's really interesting, and that's why for me, it's like, unless you get a big discount on these guys, I'm really not wanting to pay the price. Another player that I'm looking to get a discount on if I'm going to have him at all, but I'll tell you this right now, Matt, I'm not going to own any Brandon Marshall, and the reason I say that, he's coming up on 34 years old. Last year, he saw 128 targets, and he finished as the number 52 fantasy wide receiver. So there's bad quarterbacks all over the NFL, so we can't blame it all on Ryan Fitzpatrick, right? The last time that a wide receiver saw more than 120 targets and finished outside the top 36, and keep in mind, Marshall is 52, was in 2014, where both Andre Johnson and Vincent Jackson both finished outside the top 36 while seeing 120 or more targets. They are both out of football at this point. They both struggled the year after that. And I think that Brandon Marshall, I think we've seen the beginning of the decline, and people want to just say, oh, just because he's going to New York. Do we forget that Eli Manning is the streakiest quarterback in football? That Ryan Fitzpatrick wasn't like a huge step below Eli Manning the last couple of years? I don't know. I want to know how you feel about Brandon Marshall. And 2, what does his and Evan Engram's arrival mean for Sterling Shepard? Because as far as I'm concerned, Evan Engram and Sterling Shepard are almost the same player, and what they do for the Giants, playing out of the slot. Shepard's the more prototypical wide receiver, but Evan Engram he's basically a slot wide receiver, even though they're trying to say they want him to play tight end.
This is a fascinating question, and one that I've actually thought about a lot recently. And if you look at Brandon Marshall's reception perception from last year, it's pretty good. I mean, he still comes out above the above the NFL average at winning against man coverage and against zone coverage. So, I think a lot of what went wrong with his season last year was on quarterback play. But at the same time, it's kind of just above the average, and it feels really familiar to a situation, and you actually named this player from just a few years ago. It feels like Andre Johnson when he went to the Colts in 2015. I wrote an article for the Washington Post about his reception perception from his final year in Houston, and it was still really good. And I was like, oh, well, Johnson's not done yet. He can still play. And I believe he went over there right around the same age that Marshall's at now. And, the thought process is like, well, Johnson will be the number 2 receiver. He'll start across from T.Y. Hilton. He'll make guys like Dante Moncrief irrelevant. I fell into that trap right there. But
right.
Now I'm kind of questioning, because as soon as we saw Andre Johnson that year in preseason, it was like, oh no, this guy's washed. I mean, you could tell immediately. And so I'm kind of wondering if we're at a similar point there with Brandon Marshall, where his last year looks pretty good from a film and reception perception standpoint, but this could easily be the year he just falls off the cliff. And to me, I know a lot of people will say, well, what are the Giants trying to tell us about Sterling Shepard, what they believe he can do? I promise you, I would much rather take the discount on Sterling Shepard and the idea that Brandon Marshall might fall off, or even just not be like a clear number 2 receiver to Odell Beckham. Because, we just talked about the Chargers situation, trying to split up those targets. And Yeah, it's a real chore to try to split up for all these guys to be relevant, especially if you're going to put Beckham at the same sort of 160 target level, and I would expect that to be the case. I'm interested in drafting Sterling Shepard super late and seeing if he does, in fact, because again, I made the Dante Moncrief analogy, and that could easily be the same sort of situation where we saw Moncrief put up more yardage and more touchdowns than Johnson did that year. Again, it feels like a very, very similar situation.
Yeah, no, that's funny. It's funny, when I gave you that stat, I didn't even think about that when Johnson went to the Colts, because it was a big debate that offseason, but it seems like more people think that Marshall's not done than they think he is done. I happen to be on one of the side where I just don't think it's going to happen in New York. I think it's going to be extremely volatile. He'll have some weeks, sure, but I'm not taking away targets from Odell Beckham in order to make Brandon Marshall a better fantasy wide receiver. So a player that I want to talk about now, we'll hit on this one quick because I don't want to touch on too many rookies because they're not affected by too much in redraft. But as far as dynasty players goes, what's your take on Juju Smith-Schuster? When I watched him, I saw some alpha dog traits in him. Like, he has the attitude. He has the tools. He's extremely, extremely young. I think he's only 20 years old.
He's the youngest player from this last draft. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, but I see traits in him that literally can be a superstar in this league. I don't know if I'm out of my mind or, what's your take on Smith-Schuster?
Yeah, I would disagree with you that I see him as a potential superstar, but I do see him as a contributor for sure. He was one player that, he would get pretty good separation off the line of scrimmage, but then he would lose separation the longer he was in his route. He came out under the prospect average in success rate versus man coverage and zone coverage as well. But I do see him as a player who can win on some sorts of routes, kind of be, maybe at his peak, kind of a Devontae Adams sort of player if all hits right. And I know that sounds great because Adams just scored 12 touchdowns, but I think we could easily say that a lot of that has to do with Aaron Rodgers, and Adams has been an up and down player throughout his career. So I think Juju Smith-Schuster could be sort of a competent level player, but I don't necessarily ever see him being more than kind of a low-end number 2 receiver, high-end number 3. I feel very similar to him as a prospect than I did Tyler Boyd last year. And Boyd was a guy that a lot of people really liked because it's based on his production measurables and everything, age-adjusted production, very similar to Juju Smith-Schuster, but his reception perception was really poor, and he's kind of been pigeonholed like right away in his career as a player that, is just a short area slot receiver. And I think Juju Smith-Schuster is kind of that same sort of guy, but I get why the Steelers took him because they just need sort of like they needed to hit like a double at wide receiver because they were just bereft of playmakers last year after Martavis Bryant was suspended.
Oh, I feel gross after hearing about that. A Tyler Boyd comparison. Like, I don't want to hear that because I remember last offseason talking to, I think it was Sigmund Bloom, and he didn't like Boyd, and I was with him. I don't think there's anything special. And I remember someone asking me during the season last year if they should trade something for Boyd as a buy low. And I said, no, I don't think there's anything special there. I don't think that he's going to be anything more than just like, that 40 to 50 yard receiver that's a role player on a team. That's all I think he is. And man, I hope that's not the case with Smith-Schuster because I have higher hopes for him. But I wanted to touch on him. But let's get back onto one of the greatest of all time. As I tweeted out earlier today, I've got so many remarks over it. It was totally tongue-in-cheek, but there was a picture of Amari Cooper and Calvin Johnson floating around. Basically, Calvin Johnson stopped by the Raiders to give them the wide receivers some tips and whatnot and go through with them. And I said something on the picture saying basically, oh, wow, 2 of the GOATs in one picture, Amari Cooper and Calvin Johnson. And you know how many people like jumped on my back saying, what the heck are you talking about? Amari Cooper, the GOAT, blah, blah, blah. It was tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, is Amari Cooper not going to be one of the best wide receivers in football? If not starting this year, I think that this year could be the year he breaks out as the clear-cut number 1 in Oakland.
Just for social media advice purposes, next time, Mike, you should have said, oh, look, here's a nice picture with Amari Cooper and a fan. I'm
going to do that next time.
Yeah, that's even more. That's even. Hey, wait a couple months and just tweet that out. People will have forgotten about your first tweet by then. So it's going to happen. That's perfect. But you talk about Amari Cooper, and I think you actually, when I was posting a couple of clips of him, I think you were one of the ones that responded with he's one of the best separators in the NFL. And that's very true. Like, if you look at his route tree, I just pulled it up right now for success rate versus coverage. It's all greens and yellows, which means they're all either above average or right at the NFL average. The only 2 routes that are just even at the average and aren't above are the out and the slant. Everything else is, crystal clear for him. But in terms of becoming the clear number 1, I mean, at this point, we have 2 years worth of these guys together. That is Cooper and Michael Crabtree. Crabtree continues to, at least pace Cooper in targets. He also continues to be, I think, one of the most confounding questions for fantasy players the last 2 years is, why don't the Raiders use Amari Cooper more in the red zone? And this is just a hypothesis, as I'm not pitching this as the clear conclusion, but if you look at Amari Cooper's reception perception results, he obviously, as you know, and as I mentioned, he's one of the better separators in the NFL. But if there's an area that he's not great at, it's at winning contested catches. And you would hypothetically think down there in the red zone, of course, you can design plays to get players open in the red zone. I mean, we see, Eric Decker is a perfect example of a guy that the Jets did that a lot with in 2015. But if you look at his contested catch conversion rate over his career, in 2014 in a partial college sample of 50%, that's below the prospect average. Then the last 2 years, 2015 61.5%, 2016 56.1%. The NFL average is about 64% conversion rate. So you see that he's just under that NFL average in terms of winning contested catches, whereas Michael Crabtree is consistently one of the better receivers, 85.7% contested catch conversion rate this year. That's one of the better scores from the 2016 season. So, maybe that's why, again, hypothesis as to why the Raiders don't use him more down there. They see Crabtree as more of that guy, and I think the scores do bear that out. So to me, it's just tough. It's tough to kind of tell myself the story from a target and usage perspective where Cooper takes that, because I think he's already a great player. And I think we've seen who he is at the NFL level. It's not as if he needs to get better as an individual. So I don't know. And he's really expensive in fantasy drafts too. I think each year, the last 2 years that he's been drafted, it's kind of been with that assumption that he's going to become the number one receiver. And it might well happen, because I do believe he has the ability. So it's not really a question of how good he is. It's just more of a question of what's the usage going to be like, where the target's going to go, etc.
Yeah, that's the thing with him. So basically, and it's funny because I would have liked to have gotten a discount on him. I would have liked to see Crabtree closer to his range, because right now you see him going at the beginning to mid-second round, and you're basically not getting a discount. But at the same time, you look at last year, he was a wide receiver 1. He finished as a number 12 wide receiver, while scoring, get this, Matt, he scored just 9 fantasy points inside the red zone last year. Mm-hmm. Seth Roberts actually saw 6 more red zone targets than Amari Cooper did last year. So they're not designing plays for him. They're not really targeting him that much in the red zone. I think that could change. Hopefully it's just another year with Derek Carr, and that it hopefully evolves into one of the better connections in the league. And like I said, he's only scored 5 touchdowns last year. He only scored 9 points in the red zone, but yet he still finished as the number 12 wide receiver. So I think people are just aiming for that ceiling of Amari Cooper and thinking that Michael Crabtree is going to step off at some point and fall into that wide receiver 3 territory. One of the players that we saw take a massive, massive leap last year, and this year I believe that this player is Dante Moncrief, but the one player I want to talk to you about is Davante Adams. Eerily similar as to what is going on with Moncrief this offseason leading in. They both have an elite quarterback. They both play on a team with a horrible defense. They've both been kind of forgotten about. We knew they had massive potential. But what is your take on Davante Adams? Do you think it's possible that he overtakes Jordy Nelson this year as the Packers wide receiver to own?
Oh, I mean, when you sent me that question, I had to think about it a lot, because there's a couple angles there to take it. And for one, do I think Adams is capable of being a clear-cut number 1 receiver in the NFL? I do not think that. If you look at his reception perception, he was really great on a handful of routes last year. And, if you remember that Bears game on Thursday night.
I remember.
Sorry to remind you, but where I believe he had 13 catches to Jordy Nelson's 1. I tweeted out the Next Gen Stats route map that night from that Bears game, and just Adams just whipping them on curls and curl after curl, just those easy split back to the quarterback. And I think that's what made Adams so successful, because if you look at his rookie year reception perception, that was just a train wreck, and that's why I predicted that he would not have that big sophomore season that a lot of people were kind of penciling him in to take before, especially after Jordy Nelson went down with the ACL. I think once they kind of minimalized his responsibility, just shortened his route tree a little bit, also, have him not be the clear-cut number 1 outside target, it really made things easier for him and just allowed him to make plays, because he's great at winning passes in tight coverage. He's just not much of a true every level of the field dominator. And so, it's just a question whether is Jordy Nelson going to fall off? And that's the hardest part for me, because if you look at his reception perception, I'm really nervous about that fall off, because especially in the first half of the season, his scores were really a train wreck. And Of course, you can easily say, well, he's coming back from an injury, and I guess that's part of the point. But also, he really started having more fantasy success and more reception perception success when they started to up his slot routes in the second half of the season. So I think he kind of needs to begin to go down that sort of Larry Fitzgerald path in terms of being more of a short area possession slot receiver, kind of taking those deep routes off, and doing more in the short to intermediate areas. So I think this could be the year he starts to take a step back, but I don't know if I necessarily think that means that Davante Adams then needs to take the step forward. Talk about Aaron Rodgers and what a fantastic quarterback he is. I mean, even Randall Cobb's scores from last year in terms of beating man coverage were not very good. So I think more it's just like the Green Bay receiver core is just really at a crossroads here, and they didn't do anything this offseason to really address that all that much.
Well, that's the thing. So I'm always trying to buy guys that are being thrown to by a quarterback that's basically the greatest of all time, Aaron Rodgers. So argue with me all you want, Twitter. Aaron Rodgers will go down as the best of all time. Like, that is not a question in my mind. Watching the guy it's magic what he does. So I'm buying everybody on the Packers that I can, and that includes Geronimo Allison, who saw a little bit of targets last year, and he did a lot with them. They drafted D'Angelo Yancey, who is kind of going unnoticed inside dynasty drafts for whatever reason, because he was drafted in front of Malachi Dupree. He was drafted in front of him, but yet people are still drafting Dupree before it. I'm not really understanding it, but I'm always buying the pass catchers for Aaron Rodgers. And, you mentioned Jordy Nelson and the fact that, he may need to go that Larry Fitzgerald route, and I'm with you 100% because you saw his yards per reception go from, in the high 15s like he was for most of his career down to 13 last year. So they're going to start using him differently, which means Davante Adams should be the number one outside receiver. The question is, what does that mean for Randall Cobb? Are you concerned about Randall Cobb going forward, or is he someone that you'd prefer to buy in dynasty leagues?
Yeah, the funny thing about Randall Cobb is like his 2014 data, when he had that real breakout season was fantastic, but it's really fallen off just in terms of his ability to beat man coverage and press coverage especially. I think that was just kind of the outlier season at this point in terms of that 2014 year, but he's no longer priced at that point. And as I mentioned, the Packers did not do all that much to address the wide receiver position. So you'd have to imagine that he is going to still play a big role this year at least, although his contract does get expensive. I mean, it already is actually probably too expensive, but at the same time, he's going to be out there on the field. And if there's one thing we know about the Green Bay Packers, what Aaron Rodgers wants, Aaron Rodgers gets. If Aaron Rodgers doesn't like you, you don't get on the field. And if Aaron Rodgers likes you, you get on the field. He's been adamant about Davante Adams. I talked about that Bears game. One of the, when he had those 13 catches, one of the quotes from after the game from Aaron Rodgers is, "That's just everything Davante showed me in practice." And that's why I've always kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of why he always continued to stick up for him, even during that real awful 2015 season. And then I can specifically remember after that Cowboys, or what was it, the game that this playoff that Randall Cobb had the big game. It wasn't against the Cowboys. I think it was the week before that. Oh, it was against the Giants, right? Because they played the Giants first. But either way,
it had to have been the Giants.
Yeah, he had a big playoff game, and he said, and after the game, they asked Rodgers about that, and he very specifically said, "We're a better offense when number 18 is on the field." He kept reiterating that point. Mm-hmm. So I think we're still going to see a lot of Randall Cobb this year. And right now he's going, in the double-digit rounds. Sometimes he went in, I believe, the 10th round of our NFL fantasy mock draft recently. His ADP is around wide receiver 37 on Fantasy Football Calculator. So, he's still going to be one of the more highly targeted players in an offense with a great quarterback that doesn't have a clear number one receiver to me at this point anymore.
Yeah, I think that he could be one of those players that we're all like, what the heck were we thinking dropping him as far as we did? Because he's a guy that we were looking at as a wide receiver 1 last year, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I'm 100% with you on that one. It might be something that a lot of us are just overlooking, maybe expecting too much from Jordy or expecting even too much from Adams, and it just becomes, one of those Saints-type offenses where Rodgers just spreads it around because he's got Ty Montgomery out of the backfield. They have Martellus Bennett as a tight end now. So,
also, we're pretty hard on disappointing players. To be honest with you, like, yes, we overreact we're such emotional creatures, and we make like this is a very, like, fantasy football is a very should be a very logic and statistical based game, but we make emotional decisions, and a guy like Randall Cobb, who dynasty owners, started to make a second round startup pick after that 2014 season. He's been drafted highly the last 2 years in redraft leagues. People are pissed off. People are burned, and they're going to be like, nope, not doing the Randall Cobb thing again. And, I said famously on our podcast, another stupid thing I've said was that, like, if Randall Cobb doesn't finish inside the top 15 wide receivers this year, then something has gone horribly wrong. Well, I guess what went horribly wrong was my ability to predict the future. But nevertheless, and so with those sort of aggressive, then, like, it's one thing when you disappoint, but then it's another when you double down on a disappointing season. So people aren't going to want to invest in Randall Cobb. But if you just look at this logically, I mean, it doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of just what he's going to do if he's on the football field there.
That's a good point. And I think this is a great segue to go into, you said disappointment, and we're hard on those with disappointments. One of those players right now is Laquan Treadwell. This is a player I'm really torn on because I wasn't like overly high on him last year, but I felt like he was going to be a decent wide receiver in the NFL. And then, he barely saw the field. And now we're looking at it. Now they signed Michael Floyd. So it's like, oh my God, is he still not going to get on the field in 3 wide receiver sets? Are you buying in Dynasty, or are you staying away from Laquan Treadwell?
It would really depend on what the price is. And I know that seems like kind of a cop-out answer, but if you look at it right now, you mentioned that starting in 3 wide receiver sets. The notes out of OTAs today from the Vikings was that he was alongside Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs in the 3 wide receiver set. Of course, Michael Floyd is just kind of getting there, but Floyd's not a good player. Like, he had the great stretch in 2015, but if you just look throughout the entirety of his career, that looks like the clear outlier in terms of what else has gone on throughout Michael Floyd's career. Really ugly 2014 season, a real ugly 2016 season, and then there's that stretch where he was really dominant in 2015. But to me, I'm not like real too scared about Michael Floyd being there, but it all comes down to Treadwell. I mean, if you just look at the history of receivers who have been that unproductive in their rookie season, like haven't seen the field that much, it's pretty ghastly. So you're really kind of betting on him being an outlier. But if there's one thing you can kind of take some hope in, is that the Mike Zimmer Vikings have been pretty slow with young players, and they're much more willing to default to veterans. There's just not as much opportunity necessarily, I think, in Minnesota than there was maybe when Treadwell got drafted. And I was really high on Laquan Treadwell as a prospect. I thought, his reception perception is really good because he's a really great technician. Of course, that looks a lot better in college than it does against, NFL when the speed is much faster, and we know he's not a great athlete. But to me, the guy to buy in the receiver core in Minnesota is still clearly Stephon Diggs. That guy's I think he's on a superstar trajectory if he can stay healthy and play 16 games. And, right now I'm looking at his ADP in the 8th round, and like, that's just way, 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 way too low.
Wow, I didn't realize in MFL 10s he's going a lot higher than that, but I hadn't realized it. I actually pulled up Fantasy Football Calculator, and I see that 8th round, 34th receiver off the board. That's kind of a joke.
Yeah, that's
Diggs.
That's
yeah, that's.
But I think
that's nuts.
In MFL 10s, you're looking at. It's always important to kind of put this into perspective because you're just looking at completely different drafters. You're looking at MFL 10s. You're looking at a lot more sharp drafters. You're also looking at a lot of people that play Dynasty and are just more familiar with that sort of those sort of players that are more less out there to the public, but definitely more known to, like I said, Dynasty and sharp players.
You know what's hilarious about that, Matt, is right when I moved back from Arizona, so in Arizona I couldn't play MFL 10, so I moved back to Chicago, and Evan Silva, we were having a conversation, and I said Jack Doyle is being drafted outside the top 20 tight ends. He's like, what are you talking about? And he starts laughing at me. I'm like, I'm not kidding. And he's like, I'm telling you, you're wrong. So I pull it up on my phone, and I'm like, look, and I show him. He's like, oh, that's calculator. He's like, no, in MFL 10s, he's not. And I'm like, well, I was looking at something completely different. So I think it's good to talk about that and reference, what it is, because Stephon Diggs should not be going as a 34th receiver off the board. It's funny, and so how it kind of plays into that, I'm looking at this. One spot above Stephon Diggs is a player I wanted to talk about next, and that's Jamison Crowder. I want to actually talk about the entire Redskins wide receiver core. This is probably going to be one of our last questions, but I want you to rank these players in fantasy for 2017 PPR settings. So if you're talking Jamison Crowder, Terrell Pryor, and Josh Doxson, how would you how would you rank them going into the season?
Well, you know how I feel about rankings, but because I like you, Mike, I will I'll rank them. And I guess since this is Fantasy Pros podcast, it would be sacrilegious if I refused a rankings question. But I would go Terrell Pryor because I think he has the widest range of outcomes of any of these players. Because I think he has a great ceiling. I mean, if you look at him just as an individual player, one of the best things that he did in his reception perception sample last year was on the slant route. And if you look at Washington's offense, it is highly based around getting those easy to hit throws for Kirk Cousins. I can just imagine, Kirk Cousins rolling out of the pocket and dumping Terrell Pryor a slant route and him making plays in space. I mean, I think he has really great ceiling perspective, but there's also a low floor there with Pryor because he's only on a 1-year deal. They obviously want Josh Doctson to succeed, but Doctson would not be my third. He would be my third ranked player, and Crowder would be the second one there. And I think Crowder has a really clear outlook, whereas he might not have that necessary ceiling of a Terrell Pryor, and that's why there's a few rounds difference in their ADP. It was a really clear outlook to me because I actually just tweeted this a little bit before we came on the podcast. His reception perception results look eerily similar to Golden Tate's. And if you think about that, that's really, they should be used sort of in the same way. Yep. Tate played outside of the slot last year, but he's had his best productive seasons in Detroit playing as an interior player. And I believe that's exactly who Jamison Crowder is. To me, he's a candidate for 90 catches this year, much like, again, Tate has done it if that offense is firing on all cylinders. But that brings us to Josh Doctson, who's kind of the unknown in this situation, much like Laquan Treadwell did about nothing his rookie year. So did Josh Doctson. But apparently the reports at OTAs today is that he's making plays, he's doing some things, he's turning some heads, which is great because we just want to see him, be healthy and get on the field because he's the one that really, of all these players, as much as I like Terrell Pryor, he's the one that profiles more of as a traditional number one wide receiver and obviously has the investment behind it to bank on that. So I mean, Doxson's definitely worth a dart throw if we continue to, I always tell people in the offseason, it's all about following the drumbeat. And, that's a hat tip to my boys Sigmund Bloom and Cecil Lammy from the Audible podcast of Football Guys. That's something I've definitely taken from them out of their lexicon. And that's just follow that offseason drumbeat. So if we're kind of hearing those early beats right now for Josh Doctson out of OTAs, if that continues to crescendo into training camp and crescendos into a few good preseason performances or two, then that's when you really want to buy in on the Josh Doctson experience. And I think that's what I'm really hoping to see that progression throughout the offseason.
I'm with you. I have not forgot about Doctson. I think a lot of people have. And, it's funny because once Terrell Pryor went there, I wrote up a piece basically stating why I'm a little hesitant to draft Terrell Pryor, especially as ADP. I think he's being drafted towards his ceiling. He's being taken right around the 20th wide receiver off the board in the start of the 4th round. So when looking at Kirk Cousins and what he has done in the offense there, he has never targeted a wide receiver more than 6.9 targets per game. And that was in 2016 to Pierre Garçon, who finished with 114 targets. No other wide receiver with Kirk Cousins has finished with more than that. So when you talk about Terrell Pryor last year, I know he impressed, but he also saw 140 targets, which is not going to happen. He's surrounded by a lot more talent this year. I think Jamison Crowder is probably honestly the safer pick for me. And I know you said that he's more predictable. I actually have him in my projections. I have Crowder as he only showed up as 4 PPR points more than Pryor. Now, that's where your feel has to come in and basically, so my feel is going to override a little bit. So I put Pryor a little bit above Jamison Crowder in PPR just because I know the range of outcomes. But when you see Terrell Pryor going at the start of the 4th round, that is more than enough for me to back away and say, I'll take Jamison Crowder, later as like the 33rd, 35th wide receiver off the board. And then maybe if I don't take him, I'll take Doctson in the 60s or wherever he's going. He's just dirt cheap. So, some players are just drafted towards their ceiling. And, as much as you and I love Allen Robinson, this is how we're going to close out the show.
Oh, great. Let's close out on a fun note.
Yeah. Allen Robinson, Matt and I are both big fans of this guy. Like, we've backed him up and people try and fight with us on Twitter about it. But Allen Robinson is a great talent. 2016 was not his year. I'll give him that. But I think that there's something to be said about consistency of bad targets and his drops and it was just like some mental errors he had, and I think it could come to the point of inconsistent passes from Blake Bortles. So, Matt, I ask you, can we start a petition to have Blake Bortles benched for Chad Henne in 2017?
Well, I don't know if I could because Allen Robinson and I, we have a little bit of a relationship since we met, a few summer, last summer or whatever. So
Yes,
I don't know if I can publicly petition to have his quarterback bench. I don't think he would appreciate that at the very least. But in terms of last year, you mentioned some of those mental lapses, and if there's one portion of his reception perception that did really alter a lot, it was his low contested catch conversion rate and his high drop rate. Two things that he was above the NFL average in winning contested catches consistently his first two seasons and was below the average in drop rate. But, there's a really good feature that I tweeted it out yesterday. I would encourage everybody to go find it on Bleacher Report that interviews Allen Robinson, talks a lot about his tattoos and his mindset and all that sort of stuff. And he definitely even said, last year took a toll on him. He was definitely mentally, just kind of frustrated, and I think it seeped over into his play, and maybe that's why you saw some of those errors in terms of catching the football. But one newer kind of metric that was kind of intuitive, I probably should have done a long time ago, is I'm just showing how what percentage of the receiver's targets were a contested catch. And Allen Robinson, sure enough, is tied with Rashard Matthews in the guys that I have right now, is tied with Kenny Britt. For the highest passes or highest percentage of their targets that were a contested catch at 31.3%. And as I mentioned, he was below the NFL average in converting those at 56%. So, that I think a lot of people just naturally assume you're not getting, you're getting a lot of contested catches. That means you're not a good separator. And that's not always necessarily true. I think that's again, I talked about assumptions that people just, make, because if you look at some of the other players in the sample that have high contested catch rates, they're guys like Antonio Brown and Keenan Allen, it's about the high degree of difficulty passes that you get. And if you think about Allen Robinson, not many players see a more high degree of difficulty in terms of their targets. Not only does they come from a bad quarterback, but they're on deep, slow developing routes, along the sideline. He has to win a lot of those contested catches. And I would like to see, if he's going to rebound in 2017, it's even more so than Blake Bortles improving. It's about the Jaguars finding ways to get the ball into his hands on more, easy chunk plays. And that's just what you should do with your number one receiver. And if there's anything that we can take away as a positive, it's that, it's a small sample, but in the last two games with Doug Marrone as the coach, they did a lot more playing him at flanker instead of just having him run up against press coverage against the top cornerbacks, down in, down out, and getting down the field. And also his curl route rate came up. Just again, much more sort of easy to hit, just quicker developing routes than those slow ones down the field. So if he's going to rebound in 2017, I think it's going to have a lot to do with that, even more so than just his quarterback play. But I still have a great belief in the player. Definitely was a bit of a down season for him last year. I mean, he's obviously admitted that publicly himself, but I really have a lot of faith in the guy to bounce back. But, from a fantasy sense, it's going to come down to usage and quarterback play.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, a lot of things do come back to that. I think that as we've talked throughout this episode, we've talked about quarterback play, and, a lot of the wide receivers that we feel really good about are the players that have great quarterbacks. So when you're talking about Allen Robinson, a guy that's being, drafted in the second round, it's tough for me to feel okay, even though I love the talent. It's going to be a little bit inconsistent in terms of quarterback play. But Matt, I want to thank you as always for coming on, man. We really appreciate it. If you guys want to go check out his work, you can check him out on Twitter at MattHarmon_BYB. He's always active on there. You could talk to him about food. You could tell him to keep pestering me about growing up and eating more food than I do at my third grade level. Do whatever you want. Find me on Twitter at Mike Tagliere NFL. I will be there, and I'm going to do my best Bobby impression to close out the show. Thank you as always for listening, and enjoy your football.
I just wanted you to watch me dissolve slow.